Just gonna wait for people. Just gonna wait for a cigarette. Okay. Okay. Welcome to anybody who will watch back the stream, I guess. Let's go into YouTube, see if anybody is actually tuning in already. Um, reconnect the VPN. Nobody is in yet. Oh, somebody has come in, or that just me. That might just be me. Okay, so welcome to those who are tuning in after the stream. It is a Tuesday night here where I'm at, and tonight I thought I would continue reading the book that I was reading last Tuesday, and that is COVID-19, The Great Reset, by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Mallory. Klaus Schwab is the more important name, chairman of the World Economic Forum. This is the official manifesto of the World Economic Forum, The Great Reset. Some of you probably have family members, or some of you believe in conspiracy theories involving the Great Reset. Will there be truth to the conspiracy theories that you might hold to? As long as you're not a complete tinfoil nut who thinks it's satanic Jewish communists, you're probably fine. Um, so, yes, we have that book. And the reason I'm reading the book is to try and appeal to people on both the left and the right who have concerns. And during the last stream, I read the introduction, so you could go back and watch that. I will leave a link to that first one in the description once I finish this stream. I'll edit the description, put that one in there. Um, or you, I'll also set up a playlist after the stream is done as well, where the future weeks of this stream reading this book um will get put. And so before I read the introduction last time, which is why I think reading the first one would be indispensable for you if you haven't seen it. I went through a video by a channel called Bears Markers, which is a Marxist take on the Great Reset in the world. This, the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, it's not communist. I cannot make that clear enough to people who think it is. This is coming from a communist who opposes whatever is in this book, regardless of what's in it, because I'm a communist. Now, I should point out, like normal, my streams are not for kids. They're not for kids. I smoke. I'm willing to swear. uh, last Thursday, when I was playing Workers and Resources Soviet Republic, I was drinking. So, my streams are not for kids. But if you are a kid, 16, 17, and you are insistent, don't start smoking. Drink socially. I usually will not be drinking on the streams because it's a bit excessive. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't drink very often. I just bought a 10 pack of the hard rated. Used to be called hard solo. Basically like the solo lemon crush or lemon squash soft drink, but alcoholic. Um, so that was fun. But today I'm going to continue reading The Great Reset, starting chapter 1. So, chapter 1 is titled The Macro Reset. So, the introduction basically stated so we have chapter 1 being called The Macro Reset, chapter 2 being The Micro Reset, and chapter 3 being The Individual Reset. It's going from the macro level through to the individual level. So, I'll just finish this cigarette. Then we will begin. Okay, let's begin. This is the second stream reading COVID-19, The Great Reset. Okay. Now, if I see people pop into the X space, which I started half an hour before the stream, and have some discussions parts of the way through. But if no one enters the space and I don't see anything in the live chat on my phone over here, um, I will just keep reading. So, all right. Chapter 1, Macro Reset. The first leg of our journey progresses across 5 macro categories that offer a comprehensive analytical framework to understand what's going on in today's world and how this might evolve. For ease of reading, we travel thematically through each separately. In reality, they are interdependent, which is where we begin. Our brains make us think in linear terms, but the world that surrounds us is non-linear. That is to say, complex, adaptive, fast-paced, and ambiguous. 1.1 Conceptual Framework. 3 Defining characteristics of today's world. The macro reset will occur in the context of the 3 prevailing secular forces that shape our world today: interdependence, velocity, and complexity. This trio exerts its force to a lesser or greater degree on us all, whoever or wherever we may be. Interdependence. If just one word had to distill the essence of the 21st century, it would have to be interdependence. A byproduct of globalization and technological progress, it can essentially be defined as the dynamic of reciprocal dependence among the elements that compose a system. The fact that globalization and technological progress have advanced so much over the past few decades has prompted some pundits to declare that the world is now hyperconnected, a variant of interdependence on steroids. What does this interdependence mean in practice? Simply that the world is concatenated, linked together. In the early 2010s, Kishore Mahbubani, sorry for the name wrong, an academic and former diplomat from Singapore, captured this reality with the boat metaphor. The 7 billion people who inhabit planet Earth no longer live in more than 100 separate countries. Instead, they all live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. In his own words, this is one of the greatest transformations ever. In 2020, he pursued this metaphor further in the context of the pandemic by writing, "If we 7.5 billion people are now stuck together on a virus-infected cruise ship, does it make sense to clean and scrub only our personal cabins, while ignoring the corridors and airwells outside through which the virus travels?" The answer is clearly no. Yet this is what we have been doing. Since we are now in the same boat, humanity has to take care of the global boat as a whole. I will comment on this. It's funny how he uses a boat metaphor when, people in Australia would probably think of like the Ruby Princess, that shit show. That is very funny that he uses a boat metaphor. Uh, An interdependent world is a world of deep systemic connectivity in which all risks affect each other through a web of complex interactions. In such conditions, the assertion that an economic risk will be confined to the economic sphere, or that an environmental risk will be confined to the economic sphere, or that an environmental risk will not have repercussions on risks of a different nature, economic, geopolitical, and so on, is no longer tenable. We can all think of economic risks turning into political ones, like a sharp rise in unemployment leading to pockets of social unrest, or of technological risks mutating into societal ones, such as the issue of tracing the pandemic on mobile phones, provoking a societal backlash. When considered in isolation, individual risks, whether economic, geopolitical, societal, or environmental in character, give the false impression that they can be contained or mitigated. In real life, systemic connectivity shows this to be an artificial construct. In an interdependent world, risks amplify each other, and in so doing, have cascading effects. That is why isolation or containment cannot rhyme with interdependence and interconnectedness. So, so this is why, I don't really like it when people say that they don't really care what goes on in other countries. Now, there is a certain extent to which this may be tenable, to which it may be tenable to not really care what's going on. But especially when it comes to big events in other countries, um, like geopolitics is not something that can be ignored. Um, yeah, I just thought like that's a bit of a pet gripe of mine when I hear, don't care what's going on in other countries. Because at the end of the day, it affects all of us. Everything does. It's a bit naive to think that you can really close yourself up in your own sphere. Um, as much as it might be enticing, you have to face reality to a certain degree. We do live in a world that is connected in this way. I do broadly agree with what is being said here. Just this section, to be clear. Um, Obviously, we're going to get to points where, you know, major disagreement. No, let's continue. The chart below, extracted from the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report 2020, makes this plain. It illustrates the interconnected nature of the risks we collectively face. Each individual risk always conflates with those from its own macro category, but also with the individual risks from the other macro categories. Economic risks appear in blue, geopolitical in orange, societal in red, environmental in green, and technological in purple. In this manner, each individual risk harbors the potential to create ricochet effects by provoking other risks. As the chart makes clear, an infectious diseases risk is bound to have a direct effect on global governance failure, social instability, unemployment, fiscal crises, and involuntary migration, to name just a few. Each of these, in turn, will influence other individual risks, meaning that the individual risk from which the chain of effects started, in this particular case, infectious diseases, ends up amplifying many other risks, not only in its own macro category, societal risks, but also in the other four macro categories. This displays a phenomenon of contagion by systemic connectivity. In the following subchapters, we explore what the pandemic risk might entail from an economic, societal, geopolitical, environmental, and technological perspective. Now, this is the chart that has been put on the screen. It is probably a bit hard to see this. Um, yeah, it's a bit hard to see it. It's too yeah, it'll be yeah, it probably doesn't matter all that much, but yeah. Interdependence has an important conceptual effect. It invalidates silo thinking. Since conflation and systemic connectivity are what ultimately matter, addressing a problem or assessing an issue or a risk in isolation from the others is senseless and futile. In the past, this silo thinking partly explains why so many economists failed to predict the credit crisis in 2008 and why so few political scientists saw the Arab Spring coming in 2011. Today, the problem is the same with the pandemic. Epidemiologists, public health specialists, economists, social scientists, and all the other scientists and specialists who are in the business of helping decision makers understand what lies ahead find it difficult and sometimes impossible to cross the boundaries of their own discipline. That is why addressing complex trade offs, such as containing the progression of the pandemic versus reopening the economy, is so fiendishly difficult. Understandably, most experts end up being segregated into increasingly narrow fields. Therefore, they lack the enlarged view necessary to connect the many different dots or provide the more complete picture the decision makers desperately need. Let me see how long this section is. The velocity. The above firmly points the finger at technological progress and globalization as the primary culprits responsible for greater independence. In addition, they have created such a culture of immediacy that it's not an exaggeration to claim that, in today's world, everything moves much faster than before. If just one thing were to be singled out to explain this astonishing increase in velocity, it would undoubtedly be the internet. More than half, 52% of the world's population, is now online, compared to less than 8% 20 years ago. In 2019, more than 1.5 billion smartphones, a symbol and vector of velocity that allows us to be reached anywhere and at any time, was sold around the world. The Internet of Things now connects 22 billion devices in real time, ranging from cars to hospital beds, electric grids and water station pumps, to kitchen ovens and agricultural irrigation systems. This number is expected to reach 50 billion or more in 2030. Other explanations for the rise in velocity point to the scarcity element. As societies get richer, time becomes more valuable and is therefore perceived as ever more scarce. This may explain studies showing that people in wealthy cities always walk faster than in poor cities. They have no time to lose. No matter what the causal explanation is, the end game of all this is clear. As consumers and producers, spouses and parents, leaders and followers, we are all being subjected to constant, albeit discontinuous, rapid change. We can see velocity everywhere, whether it's a crisis, social discontent, technological developments and adoption, geopolitical upheaval, the financial markets, and, of course, the manifestation of infectious diseases. Everything now runs on fast forward. As a result, we operate in a real-time society with the nagging feeling that the pace of life is ever increasing. This new culture of immediacy, obsessed with speed, is apparent in all aspects of our lives, from just-in-time supply chains to high-frequency trading, from speed dating to fast food. It is so pervasive that some pundits call this new phenomenon the dictatorship of urgency. It can indeed take extreme forms. Research performed by scientists at Microsoft shows, for example, that being slower by no more than 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second, is enough for a website to lose hits to its faster competitors. The all-embracing result is that the shelf life of a policy, a product, or an idea, and the life cycle of a decision maker or a project are contracting sharply and often unpredictably. Nothing illustrated this more vividly than the breakneck speed with which COVID-19 progressed in March 2020. In less than a month, when the maelstrom provoked by the staggering speed at which the pandemic engulfed most of the world, a whole new era seemed to emerge. The beginning of the outbreak was thought to have taken place in China sometime earlier, but the exponential global progression of the pandemic took many decision makers, the majority of the public, by surprise, because we generally find it cognitively hard to grasp the significance of exponential growth. Consider the following in terms of days for doubling. If a pandemic grows at 30% a day, as COVID-19 did around mid-March for some of the worst affected countries, registered cases or deaths will double in little more than 2 days. If it grows at 20%, it will take between 4 and 5 days. And if it grows at 10%, it will take just more than a week. Expressed differently, at the global level, it took COVID-19 3 months to reach 100,000 cases, 12 days to double to 200,000 cases, 4 days to reach 300,000 cases, and then 400,000 and 500,000 cases were reached in 2 days each. These numbers make our heads spin. Extreme velocity in action. Exponential growth is so baffling to our cognitive functions that we often deal with it by developing exponential myopia, thinking of it as nothing more than very fast. In a famous experiment conducted in 1975, 2 psychologists found that when we have to predict an exponential process, we often underestimate it by a factor of 10. Understanding this growth dynamic and the power of exponentials clarifies why velocity is such an issue and why the speed of intervention to curb the rate of growth is so crucial. Ernest Hemingway understood this. In his novel, The Sun Also Rises, 2 characters have the following conversation. "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. "2 ways," Mike said. "Gradually, then suddenly." The same tends to happen for big, systemic shifts and disruption in general. Things tend to change gradually at first, and then all at once. Expect the same for the macro reset. Not only does velocity take extreme forms, but it can also engender perverse effects. Impatience, for example, is one, the effects of which can be seen similarly in the behavior of participants in the financial markets, with new research suggesting that momentum trading based on velocity leads stock prices to deviate persistently from their fundamental value or correct price, and in that of voters in an election. The latter will have a critical relevance in the post-pandemic era. Governments, by necessity, take a while to make decisions and implement them. They are obliged to consider many different constituency groups and competing interests, balance domestic concerns with external considerations, and secure legislative approval before putting into motion the bureaucratic machinery to action all these decisions. By contrast, the voters expect almost immediate policy results and improvements, which, when they don't arrive fast enough, lead to almost instantaneous disappointment. This problem of asynchronicity between 2 different groups, policymakers and public, whose time horizon differs so markedly, will be acute and very difficult to manage in the context of the pandemic. The velocity of the shock and the depth of the pain it has inflicted will not and cannot be matched with the equal velocity on the policy side. Velocity also led many observers to establish a false equivalence by comparing seasonal flu with COVID-19. This comparison, made again and again in the early months of the pandemic, was misleading and conceptually erroneous. Let's take the example of the US to hammer out the point and better grasp the role played by velocity in all of this. According to the Centers for Disease Control, between 39 and 56 million Americans contracted the flu during the 2019-2020 winter season, with between 24,000 and 62,000 deaths. By contrast, and according to Johns Hopkins University, on 24th of June 2020, more than 2.3 million were diagnosed with COVID-19 and almost 121,000 people have died. But the comparison stops there. It is meaningless for two reasons. One, the flu numbers correspond to the estimated total flu burden, while the COVID-19 figures are confirmed cases. And two, the seasonal flu cascades in gentle waves over a period of up to 6 months in an even pattern, while the COVID-19 virus spreads like a tsunami in a hotspot pattern, in a handful of cities and regions where it concentrates, and, in doing so, can overwhelm and jam healthcare capacities, monopolizing hospitals to the detriment of non-COVID-19 patients. The second reason, the velocity with which the COVID-19 pandemic surges and the suddenness with which clusters emerge makes all the difference and renders the comparison with the flu irrelevant. Velocity lies at the root of the first and second reasons. In a vast majority of countries, the speed with which the epidemic progressed made it impossible to have sufficient testing capabilities, and it then overwhelmed many national health systems equipped to deal with a predictable, recurrent, and rather slow seasonal flu, but not with a super-fast pandemic. Another important and far-reaching consequence of velocity is that decision makers have more information and more analysis than ever before, but less time to decide. For politicians and business leaders, the need to gain a strategic perspective collides ever more frequently with the day-to-day pressures of immediate decisions. Particularly obvious in the context of the pandemic and reinforced by complexity, as we see in the next section. Complexity. In its simplest possible form, complexity can be defined as what we don't understand or find difficult to understand. As for a complex system, the psychologist Herbert Simon defined it as one made up of a large number of parts that interact in a non-simple way. Complex systems are often characterized by an absence of visible causal links between their elements, which makes them virtually impossible to predict. Deep in ourselves, we sense that the more complex the system is, the greater the likelihood that something might go wrong and that an accident or an aberration might occur, propagate. Complexity can roughly be measured by three factors. 1. The amount of information, content, or the number of components in a system. 2. The interconnectedness, defined as the dynamic of reciprocal responsiveness between these pieces of information or components. And 3. The effect of non-linearity. Non-linear elements are often called tipping points. Non-linearity is a key feature of complexity because it means that a change in just one component of the system can lead to a surprising and disproportionate effect elsewhere. It is for this reason that pandemic models so often yield wide ranges of outcomes. A difference of assumption regarding just one component of the model can dramatically affect the end result. When one hears about black swans, known unknowns, or butterfly effects, non-linearity is at work. It thus comes as no surprise that we often associate world complexity with surprises, turbulence, and uncertainty. For example, 2008. How many experts anticipated that mortgage-backed securities originating in the United States would cripple banks around the world and ultimately bring the global financial system to the verge of collapse? And in the early weeks of 2020, how many decision makers foresaw the extent to which a possible pandemic would wreak havoc on some of the most sophisticated health systems in the world and would inflict such major damage to the global economy? A pandemic is a complex, adaptive system comprising many different components or pieces of information, as diverse as biology or psychology, whose behavior is influenced by such variables as the role of companies, economic policies, government intervention, healthcare politics, or national governance. For this reason, it can and should be viewed as a living network that adapts to changing conditions, not something set in stone, but a system of interactions that is both complex and adaptive. It is complex because it represents cat's cradle of interdependence and interconnectedness and interconnections from which it stems, and adaptive in the sense that its behavior is driven by interactions between nodes, the organizations, the people, us, that can become confused and unruly in times of stress. Will we adjust to the norms of confinement? Will a majority of us, or not, abide by the rules, etc.? The management, the containment, in this particular case, of a complex adaptive system requires continuous real-time and ever-changing collaboration between a vast array of disciplines and between different fields within these disciplines. Just to provide a broad and oversimplified example, the containment of the coronavirus pandemic will necessitate a global surveillance network capable of identifying new outbreaks as soon as they arise, laboratories in multiple locations around the world that can rapidly analyze new viral strains and develop effective treatments, large IT infrastructures so that communities can prepare and react effectively, appropriate and coordinated policy mechanisms to efficiently implement the decisions once they are made, and so on. The important point is this: each separate activity by itself is necessary to address the pandemic, but is insufficient if not considered in conjunction with the others. It follows that this complex adaptive system is greater than the sum of its parts. Its effectiveness depends on how well it works as a whole, and is only as strong as its weakest link. Many pundits have mischaracterized the COVID-19 pandemic as a black swan event simply because it exhibits all the characteristics of a complex adaptive system. But in reality, it is a white swan event, something explicitly presented as such by Nassim Taleb in The Black Swan published in 2007, something that would eventually take place with a great deal of certainty. Indeed, for years, international organizations like the World Health Organization Institutions like the World Economic Forum and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, launched at the annual meeting in 2017 in Davos, and individuals like Bill Gates have been warning us about the next pandemic risk, even specifying that it, one, would emerge in a highly populated place where economic development forces people and wildlife together, two, would spread quickly and silently by exploiting networks of human travel and trade, and three, would reach multiple countries like water containment. As we will see in the following chapters, properly characterizing the pandemic and understanding its characteristics are vital because they were what underpinned the differences in terms of preparedness. Many Asian countries reacted quickly because they were prepared logistically and organizationally due to SARS, and thus were able to lessen the impact of the pandemic. By contrast, many Western countries were unprepared and were ravaged by the pandemic. It is no coincidence that they are the ones in which the false notion of a black swan event circulated the most. However, we can confidently assert that the pandemic, high probability, high consequences white swan event, will provoke many black swan events through second, third, fourth, and more order effects. It is hard, if not impossible, to foresee what might happen at the end of the chain when multiple order effects and their ensuing cascades of consequences have occurred after unemployment spikes, companies go bust, and some countries are teetering on the verge of collapse. None of these are unpredictable per se, but it is their propensity to create perfect storms when they conflate other risks that will take us by surprise. To sum up, the pandemic is not a black swan event, but some of its consequences will be. The fundamental point here is this: complexity creates limits to our knowledge and understanding of things. It might thus be that today's increasing complexity literally overwhelms the capabilities of politicians in particular and decision makers in general to make well-informed decisions. A theoretical physicist turned head of state, President Armen Sarkisian of Armenia, made this point when he coined the expression quantum politics, outlining how the classical world of post-Newtonian physics, linear, predictable, and to some extent even deterministic, had given way to the quantum world, highly interconnected and uncertain, incredibly complex, and also changing depending on the position of the observer. This expression recalls quantum physics, which explains how everything works and is the best description we have of the nature of the particles that make up matter and the forces with which they interact. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare this quantum world. So that's 1.1. That's one section of chapter 1. I will continue, and hopefully I will just see how long the next section goes for. Wow. Until the next one is going to go for yeah, okay. gonna be a lot bigger. I'm not gonna get all this done tonight. I'm not gonna get all of 1.2 done tonight. Um, but I'm gonna have a cigarette now, and then I will start reading 1.2. Oh, I am pretty tired. I have just realized I've had the X space muted this whole time. Not like anybody's been coming in anyway. In fact, I may just end up going really gonna you know, I screwed up a bit there. But I'll just move this move that into the middle. Yeah. Um work and all the stuff. I am exhausted. Truthfully, absolutely exhausted. But I don't want to keep doing this. I want to keep doing these streams every week. I would love to do more streams. I would love to do more than just the 2 streams a week, but I'm going to stick it with it for now. Um, I might do some more spontaneous streams over time if I sort of feel like it. But yeah, really, we'll see how it goes. Oh, jeez. I'm going to take this. Yeah, it's the exhaustion is it's a bit. I'm getting there. Um, so while waiting, so the first fiction novel that I'm going to be writing, I think I might have mentioned it before. It'll be a sci-fi action romance involving AI. I have recently commissioned um, the first piece of character artwork for the titular character. Now, I haven't actually started writing the novel yet. I'm currently still in the phase of pre-reading, as I'm calling it. So I've been reading Frankenstein. And I've got plenty of other books to read, both fiction and non-fiction. There's a lot for me to read while I plan it out and do all of that. Um, Once I've finished reading Frankenstein, I will. I'll probably write a digest, um, Vanguard digest on my Substack. So it's actually been a bit since I put anything on there. Uh, but I might put a sort of book review on there. I may even record it here, put it on, and put it on this channel. So we will see. I'll see how it goes. So So I want to get this book out. It'll be it'll be my first actual fiction novel that'll be genuinely released. I have written stuff in the past, written drafts before. None of it's really been released, apart from a really early draft of a Sonic the Hedgehog fan fiction I wrote that will be floating around on the Google Play Store somewhere. um, but yeah, so that will be underway. We'll see how that goes. It's kind of like, is this going to be a thing during the reading thing, or I kind of take a smoke break? Just kind of take a smoke break and then, I don't know, just blabber on for a bit and then keep reading. Yeah, these reading streams like this would be good. Um, Hopefully, it shouldn't take too long to get through this book. I'm imagining it might take a couple of months. That's my suspicion. It'll probably take a couple of months. I've already decided what I'm going to read next, because it is relevant on these. I haven't actually read it before, so it'll be the first time I read it. That'll be pretty much the thing with the first two books I'm reading. This one, The Great Reset, haven't read it before. The next one I'll read, haven't read it before. However, I have it here. I'll have to grab it in a moment. The next book I will be reading will be Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. Now, that name might come off to some people as the first leader of the Soviet Union, the leader of the Bolshevik Party. Yes, yes, it is a Marxist analysis of imperialism as it existed in the early 20th century when it was written. Um, so it will certainly be a good one to read. And and as you'll see in the first stream reading The Great Reset, in the video, this book was mentioned, and that is because a book like this is still really relevant today. So, what's the blurb? Um, Vladimir Lenin created this hugely significant Marxist text to explain fully the inevitable flaws and destructive power of capitalism, that it would lead unavoidably to imperialism, monopolies, colonialism. He prophesied that those third world countries, used merely as capitalist labor, would have no choice but to join the communist revolution in Russia. Now, that unfortunately only came to pass in a few countries. Um, Now, do I agree with the Soviet model? No. Or at least what it became. That is a long story. But when people say that communism is totalitarian, inevitably, they're just wrong. Um, really, what really what the Soviet Union and the socialist experiments of the 20th century accomplished was a vindication of the anarchist critique of the state. That's how I moved towards anarchism, sort of realizing that fact that ultimately it was the ultimate failure of all of these experiments and their degeneration into sort of authoritarian states. It vindicated anarchism. That is ultimately what it did. It vindicated the anarchist critique of the state and all of that stuff. But I will leave that book for now and let's continue reading. Okay, start 1.2. 1.2 Economic Reset. The economics of COVID-19. Our contemporary economy differs radically from that of previous centuries. Compared to the past, it is infinitely more interconnected, intricate, and complex. It is characterized by a world population that has grown exponentially, by airplanes that connect any point anywhere to another somewhere else in just a few hours, resulting in more than 1 billion of us crossing a border each year, by humans encroaching on nature and the habitats of wildlife, by ubiquitous, sprawling megacities that are home to millions of people living cheek by jowl, often without adequate sanitation and medical care. Measured against the landscape of just a few decades ago, let alone centuries ago, today's economy is simply unrecognizable. Notwithstanding, some of the economic lessons to be gleaned from historical pandemics are still valid today to help grasp what lies ahead. The global economic catastrophe that we are now confronting is the deepest recorded since 1945. In terms of its sheer speed, it is unparalleled in history. Although it does not rival the calamities and the absolute economic desperation that societies endured in the past. There are some telling characteristics that are hauntingly similar. When in 1665, over the space of 18 months, the last bubonic plague had eradicated a quarter of London's population, Daniel Defoe wrote in A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, all trades being stopped, employment ceased, the labour, and by that the bread of the poor were cut off. And at first, indeed, the cries of the poor were most lamentable to hear. Thousands of them having stayed in London till nothing but desperation sent them away. Death overtook them on the road, and they served for no better than the messengers of death. Defoe's book is full of anecdotes that resonate with today's situation, telling us how the rich were escaping to the country, taking death with them, and observing how the poor were much more exposed to the outbreak, or describing how quacks and mountebanks sold false cures. What the history of previous epidemics shows again and again is how pandemics exploit trade routes and the clash that exists between the interests of public health and those of economics, something that constitutes an economic aberration, as we will see in just a few pages. As the historian Simon Schama describes, in the midst of calamity, economics was always at loggerheads, the interests of public health. Even though, until there was an understanding of German borne diseases. The plague was mostly attributed to foul air and noxious vapors said to arise from stagnant or polluted marshes. There was nonetheless a sense that the very commercial arteries that had generated prosperity were now transformed into vectors of poison. But when quarantines were proposed or imposed, those who stood to lose most, merchants and in some places artisans and workers, from the stoppage of markets, fairs, and trade, put up stiff resistance. Must the economy die so that it could be resurrected in robust good health? Yes, said the guardians of public health, who became part of urban life in Europe from the 15th century onwards. History shows that epidemics have been the great resetter of countries' economy and social fabric. Why should it be different with COVID-19? A seminal paper on the long-term economic consequences of major pandemics throughout history shows that significant macroeconomic after effects can persist for as long as 40 years, substantially depressing real rates of return. This is in contrast to wars that have the opposite effect. They destroy capital, while pandemics do not. Wars trigger higher real interest rates, implying greater economic activity, while pandemics trigger lower real rates, implying sluggish economic activity. In addition, consumers tend to react to the shock by increasing their savings, either because of new precautionary concerns or simply to replace the wealth lost during the epidemic. On the labour side, there will be gains at the expense of capital, since real wages tend to rise after pandemics. As far back as the Black Death that ravaged Europe from 1347 to 1351, and that suppressed 40% of Europe's population in just a few years, workers discovered for the first time in their life that the power to change things was in their hands. Barely a year after the epidemic had subsided, textile workers in Saint-Omer, a small city in northern France, demanded and received successive wage rises. 2 years later, many workers' guilds negotiated shorter hours and higher pay, sometimes as much as a third more than their pre-plague level. Similar but less extreme examples of other pandemics point to the same conclusion. Labor gains in power to the detriment of capital. Nowadays, this phenomenon may be exacerbated by the aging of much of the population around the world. Africa and India are notable exceptions. But such a scenario today risks being radically altered by the rise of automation, an issue to which we will return in section 1.6. Unlike previous pandemics, it is far from certain the COVID-19 crisis will tip the balance in favor of labor and against capital. For political and social reasons, it could, but technology changes the mix. Uncertainty. The high degree of ongoing uncertainty surrounding COVID-19 makes it incredibly difficult to precisely assess the risk it poses. As with all new risks that are agents of fear, this creates a lot of social anxiety that impacts economic behavior. An overwhelming consensus has emerged within the global scientific community that Jin Shi, one of China's leading scientists, had it right when he said in April 2020, "This is very likely to be an epidemic that coexists with humans for a long time, becomes seasonal, and is sustained within human bodies." Ever since the pandemic started, we have been bombarded daily with a relentless stream of data. But in June 2020, roughly half a year after the beginning of the outbreak, our knowledge is still very patchy, and as a result, we still don't really know just how dangerous COVID-19 is. Despite the deluge of scientific papers published on the coronavirus, its infection fatality rate, i.e., the number of COVID-19 cases, measured or not, the resulting death, remains a matter of debate. Around 0.4 to 0.5%, and possibly up to 1%. The ratio of undetected to confirmed cases, the rate of transmissions from asymptomatic individuals, the seasonality effect, the length of the incubation period, the national infection rates, progress in terms of understanding each of these is being made. But they and many other elements remain known unknowns to a large extent. For policymakers and public officials, this prevailing level of uncertainty makes it very difficult to devise the right public health strategy and the concomitant economic strategy. This should not come as a surprise. Anne Rimoen, a professor of epidemiology at UCLA, confesses, "This is a novel virus, new to humanity, and nobody knows what will happen. Such circumstances require a good dose of humility because, in the words of Peter Piot, one of the world's leading virologists, the more we learn about the coronavirus, the more questions arise." COVID-19 is a master of disguise that manifests itself with protean symptoms that are confounding the medical community. It is first and foremost a respiratory disease, but for a small and sizable number of patients, symptoms range from cardiac inflammation and digestive problems to kidney infection, blood clots, and meningitis. In addition, many people who recover are left with chronic kidney and heart problems, as well as lasting neurological effects. In the face of uncertainty, it makes sense to resort to scenarios to get a better sense of what lies ahead. With the pandemic, it is well understood that a wide range of potential outcomes is possible, subject to unforeseen events and random occurrences, but three plausible scenarios stand out. Each may help to delineate the contours of what the next 2 years could be like. So 3 plausible scenarios. Okay. We are now in 2025. This was written in 2020. Let's see which one is right, or at least closest to being. These 3 plausible scenarios are all based on the core assumption that the pandemic could go on affecting us until 2022. Note how 2022 was really sort of the last big year of it. Thus, they can help us to reflect upon what lies ahead. In the first scenario, the initial wave that began in March 2020 is followed by a series of smaller waves that occur through mid-2020 and then over a 1 to 2 year period, gradually diminishing in 2021, like peaks and valleys. The occurrence and amplitude of these peaks and valleys vary geographically and depend on the specific mitigation measures that are implemented. That one doesn't seem right because the Delta variant in 2021 shot things up. In the second scenario, the first wave is followed by a larger wave that takes place in the third or fourth quarter of 2020, and one or several smaller subsequent waves in 2021, like during the 1918 to 1919 Spanish flu epidemic. This scenario requires the re-implementation of mitigation measures around the fourth quarter of 2020 to contain the spread of infection and to prevent healthcare systems from being overwhelmed. In the third scenario, not seen with past influenza pandemics, but possible for COVID-19, a slow burn of ongoing transmission and case occurrence follow the first wave of 2020, but without a clear wave pattern, just with smaller ups and downs. Like for the other scenarios, this pattern varies geographically and is to a certain extent determined by the nature of the earlier mitigation measures put into place in each particular country or region. Cases of infection and deaths continue to occur, but do not require the reinstitution of mitigation measures. Which one is closest to what actually ended up happening? Because I know that that Delta shot things up, and then Omicron shot things up again in 2022. So are all of them wrong? Or maybe hmm. Yeah, I think it outdid them. Alright, continue. A large number of scientists seem to agree with the framework offered by these three scenarios. Whichever of the three the pandemic follows, they all mean, as the authors explicitly state, that policymakers must be prepared to deal with at least another 18 to 24 months of significant COVID-19 activity, with hotspots popping up periodically in diverse geographic areas. As we will argue next, a full-fledged economic recovery cannot take place until the virus is defeated or behind us. The economic fallacy of sacrificing a few lives to save growth. Throughout the pandemic, there has been a perennial debate about saving lives versus saving the economy. Lives versus livelihoods. This is a false trade off. From an economic standpoint, the myth of having to choose between public health and a hit to GDP growth can easily be debunked. Leaving aside the not insignificant ethical issue of whether sacrificing some lives to save the economy is a social Darwinian proposition or not, deciding not to save lives will not improve economic welfare. The reasons are twofold. On the supply side, if prematurely loosening the various restrictions and rules of social distancing result in an acceleration of infection, which almost all scientists believe it would, more employees and workers would become infected and more businesses would just stop functioning. After the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the validity of this argument was proven on several occasions. They ranged from factories that had to stop operating because too many workers had fallen ill, primarily the case for work environments that forced physical proximity between workers, like at meat processing facilities, to naval ships stranded because too many crew members had been infected, thus preventing the vessel from operating normally. An additional factor that negatively affects the supply of labor is that around the world there were repeated instances of workers refusing to return to work for fear of becoming infected. In many large companies, employees who felt vulnerable to the disease generated a wave of activism, including work stoppages. On the demand side, the argument boils down to the most basic and yet fundamental determinant of economic activity: sentiments. Because consumer sentiments are what really drive economies, a return to any kind of normal will only happen when and not before confidence returns. Individuals' perceptions of safety drive consumer and business decisions, which means that sustained economic improvement is contingent upon two things: the confidence that the pandemic is behind us, without which people will not consume and invest, and the proof that the virus is defeated globally, without which people will not be able to feel safe, first locally and subsequently further afield. The logical conclusion of these 2 points is this: governments must do whatever it takes and spend whatever it costs in the interests of our health and our collective wealth for the economy to recover sustainably. As both an economist and public health specialist put it, only saving lives will save livelihoods, making it clear that only policy measures that place people's health at their core will enable an economic recovery. Adding, if governments fail to save lives, people afraid of the virus will not resume shopping, traveling, or dining out. This will hinder economic recovery, lockdown or no lockdown. Only future data and subsequent analysis will provide incontrovertible proof that the trade off between health and the economy does not exist. That said, some US data collected in the early phases of reopening in some states showed a drop in spending and working even before the lockdown. Once people began to worry about the pandemic, they effectively started to shut down the economy, even before the government had officially asked them to do so. A similar phenomenon took place after some American states decided to partially reopen. Consumption remained subdued. This proves the point that economic life cannot be activated by fear, but it also illustrates the predicament that most decision makers experience when having to decide whether to reopen or not. The economic and societal damage of a lockdown is glaringly obvious to everybody, while success in terms of containing the outbreak, preventing deaths, prerequisite for a successful opening, is more or less invisible. There is no public celebration when a coronavirus case or death doesn't happen, leading to the public health policy paradox that, when you do it right, nothing happens. This is why delaying the lockdown or opening too early was always such a strong policy temptation. However, several studies have since shown how such a temptation carried considerable risk. Two, in particular, coming to similar conclusions with different methodologies, modeled what could have happened without lockdown. According to one conducted by Imperial College London, wide-scale rigorous lockdowns imposed in March 2020 averted 3.1 million deaths in 11 European countries, including the UK, Spain, Italy, France, and Germany. The other, led by the University of California, Berkeley, concluded that 530 million total infections, corresponding to 62 million confirmed cases, were averted in 6 countries: China, South Korea, Italy, Iran, France, and the US, by the confinement measures that each had put into place. The simple conclusion: in countries afflicted with registered COVID-19 cases that, at the peak, were roughly doubling every 2 days, governments had no reasonable alternative but to impose rigorous lockdowns. Pretending otherwise is to ignore the power of exponential growth and the considerable damage it can inflict through a pandemic. Because of the extreme velocity of the COVID-19 progression, the timing and forcefulness of the intervention were of the essence. So the next is like 1.2.2. How long does that go for? Okay. I'm going to end it here for tonight. This is going to take a while. um, But yes, I will be back to continue this one next Tuesday. And on Thursday, I will be back to playing Workers and Resources Soviet Republic. Just for the weekly gaming stream. Next Thursday, I'll be playing Sonic Racing Crossworlds on the Thursday stream, so look forward to that one. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there for now so that the next section is gonna take way too long. I'll be here until like 9:30. So I would like for these streams to not take any longer than 2 hours. So yes, I will continue that. I'll continue reading chapter 1 next Tuesday. So yeah, we have like the chapters. There's like 3 chapters, and the first one in particular is pretty huge. It's going to be a bit of a slog. So yeah, getting through that will take some time, but we'll get there. So, but yeah, I'm gonna finish that off for tonight. If you're interested in seeing me play Workers and Resources Soviet Republic, it's sort of like a civilization builder game based on like the Soviet Union. Just thought it'd be interesting. Then come along to that 6:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Thursday. So look forward to that one, and I'll see you guys either on Thursday or next Tuesday to continue the book. Good night, everyone.